So thanks everybody for joining us for the final conversation in the Meeting Places series. This event has been co-sponsored by the UAlbany English Department and the Tadagori Project. We are recording today's event and we ask that audience members please keep yourselves muted until you're asked to speak or speaking. Once we get underway, feel free to use the chat box if you got a question or the raise hand function. I'm going to kind of facilitate that process. Today, I'm joined by Christina Thyssen and Jackie S. And we're going to have a conversation about stories and storytelling. I'll be asking Jackie and Christina a series of questions that are intended to foster and guide their conversation. I'm going to do my best to stay out of the way once the back and forth gets going and intervene if things kind of get off track. When the time is right, and increasingly we've been sort of feeling that out in these sessions, we're going to open up the conversation for you guys to jump in and contribute ideas, ask questions, I don't know, cause some kind of kerfuffle. You're all welcome to do that once things kind of get underway. One of the main ideas that oriented and initiated the Meeting Places series was mainly that conversations, arguments, and dialogues play a central but largely invisible role in intellectual and creative work in the academy and in society, and that pretty much our culture at large suffers today from a lack of a sustaining and sustained meeting place where conversations can begin and develop. Conversations are more informal, idiosyncratic, and open-ended than conventional kinds of academic presentations. And our hope today is that we will end up in some unexpected place and or discover some new question or problem. Before we get started, I'm going to briefly introduce our conversationalists. So I'm happy to welcome Christina Thyssen, who holds a PhD in American literature and teaches as my colleague in the English department at the University at Albany. She also teaches writing and storytelling to incarcerated individuals. She is the co-founder and producer of On the Fly, a monthly Moss-style story slam in Catskill, New York, and is currently at work on a memoir about raising a special needs daughter. Christina is joined by Jackie S., old friend of mine, and somehow an original collaborator in the Tadagori Project before it ever even existed. She is also the author of Daryl, out from Clash Books in 2021, In the Absolute Balloon, you can find that in the Chicago Review, and Shade, which was published in the Recluse. Please welcome them. And now we're going to get started. So the first question I'd like to ask, I'll pass this one to you, Jackie, to start, is how, why, or when did the writing and or telling of stories come to be an animating concern in your life? Where did stories get into the picture?
It's a funny question for me because I think my path was like very non-linear. And so I would say that for most of the time, I've thought of myself as more of a reader than a writer, and possibly in a room like this, maybe I would hesitate to call myself a reader. I think I had literature around me in a lot of ways. I think that there was a sense that something was going seriously wrong with the kind of education that I had. And there was a sense that I was being somehow kind of ill-prepared to enter a culture that was sort of obviously shaping the world around me, and that I did not have much of a sense of, sort of how we had gotten there. So I was always interested in that. And of course, I was always interested in it from a different perspective, which is like probably more like comedy, like putting on voices. I like the idea of being able to speak as not myself. I really liked pseudonymity and these kinds of games, which, to be honest, I mean, I think I probably have done that more than I've done writing. It's just becoming a person. I think we have an excess of selfhood that we have to do something with, right? that was sort of some of the story. And then I think that maybe more recently, like over the course of the last decade, I found myself very surprisingly embedded in a kind of like an identity bound literature community, which was not a place that I ever expected to really find myself, in the sense that I don't really like to start to tell stories that begin, as a such and such kind of person, because I don't like the notion that there's some sort of I don't know, I don't want to argue about situated knowledge, but I don't like the concept that it could be automatic. I don't like that as sort of an invitation to unthought, which is how I think it usually functions. But nonetheless, I found myself there, and so I think that was a place where I think things really turned on, and I began to publish a little bit more. I started, moderating groups, and had a little workshop that we started out in the Bay Area, and anyway, that's been part of the story there. I mean, and then I went and wrote some books, and people said, "What the hell
Yeah,
are
of
you
course,
doing?"
there's that
Anyway.
part too.
Yeah, I
Beautiful.
forgot. Yeah, I wrote it. Yeah.
Well, Christina, how about you? How did you come into this idea and practice of the story and storytelling?
Well, I mean, it's been like, I like the idea of the nonlinear path, because I mean, I grew up in like is very proud academic family, where there are lots and lots of stories about who we were and what the importance of everything was. And I think for a long time, I identified very much with those stories. And then some a variety of things happened in my life. And I also went to college first back in Denmark in the 1990s, in the midst of sort of like the theory wars and the breakdown of meta narratives and all that kind of stuff. And all of a sudden, the question of stories became a lot more complicated. And I think personally, I'd always felt a little bit like an alien in my family. And so it gave me sort of a chance to theorize that a little bit. But I think when I look back now, it's the whole time I was at war with these old stories that were being told about me and my place in the world. And so for a long time, and theory became like a way that I could do that. And then at some point, I ran out of steam with the theory, and that had a lot to do with stuff that also happened in my own life. I had a special needs child who didn't fit any categories that I could fit her into, and I started teaching in prison, and specifically, I was teaching a writing class in prison one time, and the writing was like getting so in the way of content or stories, because they weren't very good writers. And so I was like halfway through the semester, and I was like, let's stop writing, let's just tell stories, right? And so then I gave them some prompts, and they started telling stories, and all of us, it was like this world opened up. It was like, I was like, wow, this is what happens when you're not constrained by language in that way, or by like the theories of the writing practice or whatever. And then we went back and wrote the stories at the end. And that was sort of the beginning of I think my shift in my own practice, also away from like something very theoretical and very sort of seeing myself as a critical scholar, a literary scholar, and embracing, both, like I started reading memoirs and in a way, like, which for me historically had been this sort of like the least important genre. Like nobody took that one seriously, right? And all of a sudden I was like, oh wow, this is like real stuff. And so I really did a full turnaround with storytelling, and I started this like storytelling organization, and now I teach storytelling in prison also, and all this kind of stuff. And it's really changed also the way I teach in the academy, like at at Albany. So I will say that stories, I've been like against and for stories in many different configurations, and it's really made many shifts and turns, but it's become this way. It's opened up a lot of stuff for me, both in the classroom and outside.
Beautiful. That leads kind of perfectly into my next sort of question for you both. What are some of the uses of stories? Like, what kinds of questions or problems can stories help us to navigate or confront? Of course, many folks like to say, stories are some sort of like species defining capacity we have. But it's hard for people to get specific about, the function of the story. So maybe Christina, yeah, could you tell us a bit about what you think how are stories useful, or what can you do with a story?
I mean, I think, and I'll say, at least in this context, I speak a lot about sort of like personal storytelling, and also about like the actual performance of storytelling, like when you do it together, not so much written, but like really sort of like getting up in a group and telling your story and stuff like that. And that's the way I've been exploring it a lot. I think that what's surprising about the personal story is that it feels like a very sort of self-centered activity in a way, but what it actually does in a classroom or in a group of people is that it opens up the space of connection between people, right? So that when somebody tells their story, and they do it in a way that allows others in to that story, I mean, sometimes I'll do it in the classroom. I'll start a semester with like a sort of a whole segment of the course on storytelling, and everybody has to get up and tell a story. And what happens is that you watch this classroom go from a room of whatever, sleeping students and a snoozy professor or whatever, to three-dimensional people that kind of identify with each other and go, even like what Jackie was talking about before, being sort of like maybe locked into or feeling sort of the constraints of an identity-based kind of community, right? Like, so you have a lot of that in a classroom where people are very identified with a particular aspect of their, of who they are. And when they start to tell stories, it like becomes really, all these boundaries kind of break down, and everybody goes, oh, I've experienced that, or, my mom's like that, or, that happened to me too. And so it immediately creates this possibility of connection in a space. And it changes everything else about what we do in the classroom also, because you can't go back from that. You can't like unknow somebody once you kind of know that there's some connection there. And so it becomes a lot more difficult to sort of bury yourself in your own little corner and say, oh, that's not for me. And so it's kind of remarkable to see what it does in the classroom, for sure. So that's one of the uses. There are many others, but maybe Jackie has some thoughts on that.
Beautiful. Yeah, Jackie, how does that strike you?
It was really interesting. It was something that I worried about a little bit on my way here, because I thought, well, I might be the only person in this room who's really not a teacher. Like I would love to, to find myself in the kind of situations where people are, willing to talk about stories and willing to talk about maybe less what they mean, but at least what they say. That, so it does happen, but I think I don't have like, and maybe this is something that's related to the framing of the event, I don't think I have a really deliberate space for that to occur. But when I'm thinking about the uses of stories, I think one thing that it does is it sort of addresses failures of speech. It addresses failures of kind of quotidian thought. The way I was putting this to a friend the other day was that I feel like I have these raps, and I have all these sort of half thoughts that are rattling around, and I could tell you a little bit of, and if I got really lucky, you might be like, oh yeah, that sounds like a maybe good idea. That's where I could go with that. But we're not really talking about anything, because in fact, we're not having the kind of conversation which is oriented towards ever finding out not only the truth, but even what we ourselves think. I mean, we might never actually find out in the course of ordinary conversation. So I think it allows kind of like a vector for sort of kicking the tires on concepts. And I think that one of the tools that it gives us to kick the tires is this kind of concept of the avoidance of cliche. That I think that not only, like, there's sort of both public and private cliches that we could be trying to sort of avoid. And that becomes sort of like, I don't know, an approach to original thought. I had some examples, because we have some intimation of what these questions are going to be, and I was thinking that maybe we could talk about maybe Coetzee's Disgrace, or had hoped to be finished with it. I'm not finished with The Magic Mountain. That's what I'm reading right now. But these books are, you know, they're willing to pause where life does not pause. And, they're willing to compress what ordinary time does not compress. And I think that in a way, it leads to, like, thinking of like Coetzee, for example, is be really topical. I mean, I think they're both really topical in a sense, but, you could say that, like, what are the real stakes of serious moral error? How can we be damaged by those errors? And what does it look like to live a life which is so damaged by moral error that you can no longer stand up for anything, including the best feelings and the best ideas that you possess? And that's a story, of a man who's done something pretty profoundly awful. I think something, that people are a little bit more and more sensitized to, actually. But and so in a way, that's a book where the ante of it keeps going up. But at the same time, I think that there's a lot of ways where you could say one of the interesting things about that story is that I don't know if people have read it, but if you read a summary of the book, what you assume that the book is about is finished in the first 30 pages. And so it is a really strong indication that you have to keep thinking. And you sort of, you don't, people don't quite die of heartbreak as you might expect in certain, romantic operas or something like that. And that as a result, there's a need to think about justice, about condemnation. I'm always hoping that stories can be a vector for thinking about things like this, which I think are not less rigorous than doing so in philosophy or law or something like that.
Oh God, Jackie, that's so rich. I was talking with a student of mine yesterday who was really looking for some easy ways out on writing a final paper on Invisible Man. And, I wasn't letting them have any, nor was Ellison. And, I kind of stole this line. I think it's a Tim Ingold line, but I sort of said, look, literary studies or literature is philosophy with people in it, which is to sort of say, exactly as you say, the slowing down, the expansion and the compression kind of puts meat on the bones of cliche concepts. I know Christina probably has some things she could say here. You're welcome to jump in if you want, Christina, before I ask another question.
Yes, I mean, I think Coetzee is the one who says that all fiction is autofiction, right? And I think that some of these boundaries that we have traditionally had between like philosophy and literature and memoir and whatever other kinds of writing are certainly breaking down for us, and I think very usefully so. And I mean, philosophy is also storytelling, right? It's just a different kind of storytelling. And there's specific characteristics of literary storytelling. I mean, I think one of the questions you had asked was this question of like, what are some of the risks and dangers of stories? And I think that's very much sort of a part of this, right? Like, so, and certainly in the way that my relationship with stories has evolved, like it's been very clear what the dangers of stories are, right? The way that they leave so much out, and I guess that's part of the compression as well, right? And so how do you both, like, stories are inherently dangerous in that way, right? Because they're not true, right? They're just they're a selection of facts, and I think that's really important. So what's her name? Chimamanda Adichie she did that TED talk about the dangers of the danger of a single story, right? And it's a very simple sort of concept in the sense that like we all can understand that, like, if we reduce somebody to one story about their life or whatever, that flattens them. But the real difficulty is, how do you tell stories that don't do that and still provide some sort of structure and some sort of space that you can live inside, right? And that you can identify with, or that you can respond to without flattening the world. And I think that is an ongoing conversation. And I think that should be the only thing we talk about in our classrooms, right? Like, because that's where like everybody's need for identity and selfhood comes up against the complicated nature of reality and all that kind of stuff. And the good stories like you're mentioning, Jackie, they nail that, right? Like they hold that in the story, that they both give you the story, but they also force you to continually push the boundaries of that story. And it feels to me like that is something that we really can help our students and others, each other, really here, right? Talk about, because there is these competing needs, right? The need for understanding the world in a way that's simple enough that we can sort of feel that we can put our 2 feet on the ground, and then this desire to also learn new, open up, complicate things. And I think that when you come across those stories, like Ellison does that so beautifully, right? I mean, in Invisible Man, this way in which, I mean, it's such a, I remember you were talking about in the last talk, the one of your students had talked about Ellison, the sort of comic book, right? Is like sort of
Yeah.
construction of that book, and the way in which it's so like hyperbolic and simple in some way, and then the layers, right? The way he describes like listening to jazz music and falling down through the cracks. But he also talks about like you kind of need the beat, right? Like you need to be able to count to 4 so that you can say 3 3/3, right? Like you have to kind of hear the beat so that you can fall through the cracks. And that to me is what stories can hold in a way that I feel like many other forms of thought struggle to do. The complexity of like, keeping, I mean, music does that too, right? Music has that sort of ability to keep us locked in both to the rhythm, and then also allowing us the possibility to see between the beats, or imagine beyond the beat, right? So for me, good stories keep us in that kind of spell.
Oh, it's such a wonderful thing. I mean, I have this sort of silly thing I sometimes say to students, which is like, there are good storytellers and there are bad storytellers. And okay, tell me what makes a good storyteller and a bad storyteller. And the first thought is efficiency, right? The good storyteller propels the plot and the characters and doesn't go down digressions. But then I say a great storyteller, of course, is the master of digression, right? Pause and then take space and time to untangle a complicated background, or to introduce some self-serving plot line that makes the story better, or whatever else. Christina jumped the gun, which I love. Jackie, do you have thoughts about what it means to get a story wrong, or the danger of a story? I mean, certainly you're right to suspect that teaching disgrace takes a lot of guts these days. I wonder, if you have an example to think about with that, or if you want to speak, more properly in terms of like writing a text that you're going to publish out to an audience, thinking about revision. You can take it how you want, but.
Wow. I mean, I have to say, sometimes I have a few things I want to say. I mean, so one version of this for me is that I think there's a lot of continuity between literary storytelling and operations like gossip. And there's a nice paper I read by Maha Jaffrey, and she talks about gossip in Middlemarch. And she says, well, look, the concept that gossip is a form of storytelling is a great one, except that we should keep in mind that it's a form of really bad storytelling. And that actually, you could say that some of what Eliot is doing sort of towards the close of Middlemarch is providing a sort of a literary critique, a sort of more formal critique of gossip. and how it ruins lives and how a story picks up steam without all of the details, and doing so in a way that's a little bit troubling because, of course, it implicates the reader, and this is sort of one of the games that the book is involved in. But I feel like that is one part of the story, is that bad storytelling and bad thinking go together and they have consequences. I was thinking about this today, I saw the news that Carolyn Bryant, the woman who falsely accused Emmett Till, she died, and after a long life, and a long healthy life, which Emmett Till was had robbed from him, right? So there is a question of what kind of stories do people find it very easy to believe, what kind of stories do people find themselves sort of resonating with rather than reading, and then we can look for that practice of reading. And I have to say that, like, I see it in sort of softer ways. I don't want to accuse people of some kind of, I don't know, there's the Adorno game where you can accuse everybody of being a fascist because of how they start their car, but I do really want to say that there seems to be something kind of sick. Like, we are constantly talking about stories in the terms almost like a fandom. Like, even people that I think of as like quite sophisticated, when they tell me about a book, they say, I am this character. They just sort of, it's point and say me is a very, very common mode of reading. And that's, it reflects, I think, a discomfort with what literary text can be and what a story can be. And it also reflects, I think, a willingness to go along that might be very concerning. So that's one side of it. I mean, another side of it that I see as a writer is that in the conditions of that kind of reading, I don't know. I mean, how seriously should I take it if that people can yell at me on the internet? Should I be afraid of that? I know that people lose their fucking minds when it happens. Pardon my French, but it does seem to be a little bit of a concern that I have, that, like, I think one of the things that for me is central, to writing a book, is that a book is a small room with an open door. And it's really important to me that, books create a kind of affordance for that kind of conversation. And I think that that's actually something that we're rapidly losing. There's a sense that hyper dissemination is always the goal, that we're here, we're having this conversation. What if we could get it to 1 million people? Well, I mean, we could, but why would that be better? Actually, that might be terrifying. We might find that we had to hedge against 1,000 potential objections, many in bad faith, and that we had to have a very different kind of conversation. So those are maybe some dangers, and actually, related to that, there's a kind of a funny way that some kinds of storytelling I think of are snitching, and that there's something valuable about life having its sort of shadowy places that not everybody knows about everything, and I guess I will point out that I guess I was unsure whether I wanted to talk about this specific context, but so I find myself embedded in a situation of trans literature, such as it is, and the thing about that is that there's a fight that's happened there on informal terms, which is that there's an assumption that every trans book is a memoir. There's an assumption that every trans book is written in order to teach people the facts about transition or trans people or something like that, or to enter into an incredibly bad faith public debate about these concepts. By the way, I mean, maybe there should be a good faith public debate about these things. I mean, it's my life, but then again, we got to figure it out. So, there's some complexity there, but I noticed that, like, one of the main questions that people have had is that they've been fighting against this assumption that everything has to be a memoir. Who is allowed to have an imagination? Is your writing going to be treated as a manual, as a confession, as a piece of evangelism or something like that? And so for me, I found that actually some of the danger is there. And I know that, the work that I've put out there, I've been sometimes very confused by the ways that it's been taken up. Some people have insisted on identifying in that, point and say me sort of style of reading that I was talking about earlier, and others have decided that I'm a person who wants to tear them down or everything down or something like that, and I, I don't want to evade responsibility, but there's something very strange going on, and I actually find more and more that it takes me a bit of nerve. In some ways, it was much easier to write the first book because my assumption was that nobody would read it. Now that a few people did, and I think about the next one, it's like, oh God, am I really going to do that? I mean, I don't even smoke. I'm taking out my own cigarette, my own blindfold. I had to get a loan to buy. Anyway, okay.
Oh, thank you, man. So rich, Jackie. I mean, Christina, it strikes me there's some stuff there in what Jackie was just saying that has this sort of interesting way that wraps up with, part of what you're doing is you have, you're in physical meat space, and there's performance, and there's, you can't point and say me because it's so obviously not you in the sort of proximal space of storytelling. And at the same time, I know we've had conversations where both the resonating versus reading dichotomy that Jackie gave us, which is great, and the point and say me thing, students struggle with that a ton in our classes. So say what you want. I mean, I think that's a beautiful segue.
Well, I think it's complicated because I totally agree with you, Jackie, that there's this sort of flattening of the world, right? Like, and into like little boxes where, you can see yourself fitting into this box or that box. But I also feel as if, there are lots of things that are troubling about our world right now, right? And I'm trying to think through ways in which, specifically in the classroom, specifically in prison, which is a whole other thing, and also in like on the community level, what uses of story actually create community as well as thought. Because my feeling is in the classroom in particular right now that for a lot of students, there's a lack of engagement because they don't feel connected to anything or anybody, right? Like they're very sort of identified with a version of themselves that they have, but they're not really able to reach out and sort of walk into the mirror hall of like, other people's stories and allowing them to reflect back on them. And so I think sometimes this sort of like, that's me reflex is actually kind of productive as a starting place, right? The problem is that it's often also where it ends, right? It's like you hear something, you see something, you read something, and you identify, and you go, okay, I got it, right? And then it actually just becomes a confining moment instead of an opening. But if you can catch people at this moment of identification or connection, because there's also a desire for connection and reaching out and creating community, I think that there's like a real possibility to open up the space there with those stories and then say, okay, so how do we take this moment of like sort of plugged in, simple story identification and use it as like, the candy that'll make the synapses shoot a little bit, and like where do we take it from here? And so I feel like there's part of taking what people already do well, which is like social media scrolling, where they go, that's me, that's not me, I don't like, right? But then rather than just say rejecting that as not as a bad impulse, using it as a tool to talk about what we do with that need for connection, right? And I think, and I know that it's very different to talk about like what it's like to write a story and what it's like to use stories in sort of a community sense, but that's really, that feels to me like such a urgent need right now, certainly in the classroom, but also in like local communities, that we're so identified with stories that come to us from elsewhere, right? And we're having a hard time maybe connecting stories across boundaries where we live and where we operate and where we move. And I remember, like, I'm just in the last conversation, this question of like, what does it mean to talk about sharing advice on like how to live in the world, right? It's like, I know that I'm reducing a lot of this down to something very existential, but I feel like that's really, for me, where this storytelling is going right now, is like, we need this toolbox to learn how to reshape our departments and classrooms and communities. And I think that there's something really powerful about stories there, and stories that are not closing off in that sense that like, oh, you know, I mean, I was raised in an academic world where it was this, the feeling was always like, no, that's not quite right. You didn't quite get it. You know, like you were never allowed to just say, oh, I got that here. Like, can we talk about it? There was always this feeling like you were supposed to, it was supposed to be so complex and difficult that you couldn't wrap your head around it. I had spent decades in that. I mean, you know, I'll read you a passage from my dissertation, you know, it's like, but and I'm just like a little bit over it, because personally it didn't get me very far, right? Like, and I also, at this point in my life, don't want to just use stories to advance my career or to have academic conversation or intellectual conversation. I want to like kind of reshape the world I want to live in, like live outside of all these other spaces as well. And that seems to me like just like a really yeah, I just want to like I don't know. So there are two sides to that question, I feel like.
Jackie, I feel like, yeah, go ahead.
I do have a response. Yeah, so I similarly had this experience. I don't want to be too cagey about it. I was also a child of academics, and you know, had a very early sense of my own kind of stupidity, you could say. And I think that what it really is that, you know, self-consciousness develops first, and everything else has to catch up. And so you know, you can have an adult sense of inadequacy as an 8-year-old or something like that, and so, you know. But the thing is that. I guess I want to push back on the idea that like this identification style reading is related to community. And I think it might be related to something a little bit more like power. And I really, I have this, this is an obnoxious reference, but I was reading Bataille recently, and I don't really like Bataille. Like, I just want to put that out there, you know, this is not an endorsement of the guy. But he has this wonderful moment where he talks, this is in the introduction to Inner Experience, he talks about how, you know, he says, look at a man and ask by what means did he quiet the urge in himself to be everything. And I thought, oh, what an amazing line. And I thought about that, and I thought, how can I understand this? Through sports, of course. And if I'm talking to a sports fan who's cheering, the last thing that they want to hear from me is, hey man, you're not winning, they are. You're not doing anything. Right, that is such a violation of the experience, because there's this sense that even though, yeah, technically it's somebody else doing it and not me, the, you know, being on the fringe of it, being aware of it, having the story of it is a kind of participation. And we have to be sort of convinced after the fact of the boring reality that I just have to be this one person, and those other people are actually the one terrible, right? And so I guess I think that a lot of the sort of participatory reading that I imagine is often related to things like that. So, and I mean, maybe this is like a style that fits more like, I don't know, I'm like 11 and I'm reading like science fiction novels, right? And I'm, you know, I'm sorry, this is not very social. I don't know. I like communities. I'm not against communities, but I don't really have a lot of interest in them, it turns out. But I guess somehow I think that that's another mode, you know, that at least produces the same kinds of affects, the same kinds of identifications. And I wonder how much, you know, how much is what, you know, because when we describe these like very insufficient lives, you could say, well, one thing that these lives are very insufficient, what are they missing? Well, maybe they're missing, you know, having a, you know, a team to play ball with or something like that, but maybe what they're missing is hitting the ball. And I kind of think it's much more often the latter. Confused
I
sports metaphors. Can you tell I wasn't really that good at this stuff?
Christina, go ahead. I can see it.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I totally, I just wanted to clarify that it's not that I think that the identification in itself is what is going to produce community or thought or anything, but I guess it feels to me like the sort of the at least historically we've had this sort of distinction between like identification and like critical thinking, right? Like there are two different things. You couldn't like, you're either like reducing the world down to its most elemental particles, or you were like complex and intellectual and always looking for, the problem, right? With whatever the identification model was doing. But what I was just saying is that since, for example, in the classroom, this is how the students are reading the world, right? Like this is what they're doing. We could tell them that they're wrong and that they're just not critical enough. But to me personally, that feels like the way, that I'm like, that's how I was raised. I was like somebody always telling me I wasn't smart enough. I wasn't, I was wrong. And it feels to me that I would rather be happy than right at this point, right? Like in a sense that I feel like if that's what I have to work with, and there is this moment of engagement in the identification model where I can reach someone because they are plugged into a story, they're plugged into a conversation, they're plugged into something a dynamic that's going on in the classroom, for example, or down the block or whatever it is. And I can take that and do something with it. James and I were talking before we got started about, he was responding to something a student had said in the classroom, and he was talking about how this thing she had said sort of became something that they could use in the classroom as a way to think through, other texts as well. And I guess that's how I'm thinking about it, that like, this is the kind of fuel we have, right? Like these are this is how a lot of these students are thinking. Because they're scrolling through Instagram, whatever we all are, right? I'm not trying to say that they are any more than I am, but I'm just saying, right? And so I do think that moments of engagement are really priceless right now, because there are so often moments of non-engagement and drawing back and not caring. And I guess that to me seems really important right now.
Good. Jackie, do you have a response? You want to keep going?
Just to say, I'm totally with you there. I mean, I somehow think that the last thing that I want to do is to produce yet another essay about why there are no more readers anymore, and where culture took a left turn and how it's all gone wrong. That I don't think that that's basically ever helpful, and then I think particularly in a classroom it doesn't work. And a lot of my context, I mean, I do have social context around writing. That's not what I do. Like I feel like I have sort of workshop settings. I have like groups of writers, where oftentimes we're more talking about how to publish and things like this, and reading each other's manuscripts, things like that. But you don't come in on the attack, with like gobs of red ink and actual blood, but that's.
Only when we were younger did we do those things.
Oh yeah, I totally did that, and you can see it in
Yes.
my personality. I didn't change at all, but
You and me both, Jackie. Well, this is perfect. This leads me to sort of the next one. I think after this question, we can kind of open it up to the room. But I feel like maybe some of the back and forth on this last one involves the term I'm about to introduce, which is experience. And you could take that in a lot of different ways, but I think there is something interesting to try and think about the relationship between experience and story, or narrative, even as a sort of frame for experience. Obviously in the point and say me thing, experience is being perhaps tapped, but there's also sort of the experience of reading, which is a totally other thing, or the experience of listening, or the experience of telling. And of course, one of the great discoveries at least for me in reading, is that there are these odd patches of really unlikely experience that might be common or at least continuous. So Jackie, do you have some thoughts about, I mean, I'd love to hear you talk about experience, story, and narrative, especially given the risks that you might write something and someone will mistake it for your experience. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, one of the ways that I write defensively around that is that I prefer to write things that could not possibly be my experience. And so, when I was very sure that I was going to be read as blah, 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 this trans woman of color or something like that, I immediately said, okay, I'm writing from the perspective of a middle-aged white guy, and he doesn't necessarily get it about these things, and I'm going to write completely sympathetically about this person, and sort of from this person's point of view. Safe. And I think it turned out to be a sort of a useful thing, partly because it wasn't only that I was on my guard against misreading. I think I'm on my guard against my own tendency. I think it's very natural to want to sort of preach out of your identity or to take your experiences at face value, and not do the kind of thinking with them that you might like to do, or that you might regret not having done. I don't know whether there's any real desire that's in the moment. But so that's kind of like one way that was for me like an artificial device to sort of separate these things. I mean, unfortunately, it's a really abstract question, and I have to say that like there's a lot of somehow the only thing that you can say that's really true is that anything goes, which I think is very unfortunate. And and of course, I think actually, it's probably not quite as wild as all of that, in the sense that there's probably a lot of stories which depend on an ongoing debate about what a story can be, and when that debate runs out of steam, those stories become completely unreadable and uninteresting. Sort of the way that like Oulipo work is boring. And I feel like there's so maybe there is actually something a little bit narrower to say, because certainly when I'm thinking about the kinds of stories that I like, I do think that they afford that kind of they afford a kind of participation beyond your experience. So I think that like adventure novels are good novels. I think that I there's a book that's going to be republished soon. It's really great. It was so hard to find a copy of it. Mortal Leap by MacDonald Harris. He was an English prof in Southern California named Donald Heine, but he wrote tons and tons of kind of like, if I describe the plot, you would say, it's kind of knockoff of Conrad, Hemingway, or something like that. But it's really good. It's really, really good. But part of it is being able to experience that kind of excess of selfhood or that excess of life. And I think that, another part of it is that, as we were saying before, there's a tendency to skip over things, to tune out of things, and, that these moments of sort of dwelling on the matter or distilling an idea, like thinking of Invisible Man, you could sort of say that like the most boring reading of that book would be to say like, it's like a sequence of encounters with the dominant ideas of the day. Like, here's Marcus Garvey, and here's socialism, and so on. And it's not bad to see those connections. But I think that maybe where that kind of reading becomes interesting is to say like, well, is there a relationship between an idea and situation other than what's on the page here? Like maybe this is actually how ideas relate to situations, in the sense that there's always a little bit of a burden of interpretation, there's always a bit of a burden of storytelling, some way of kind of bringing it out. And I think that maybe, like I think there was like a moment in my life where I was like really optimistic reading Hegel, thinking that I could like do that by that would eventually have this kind of like pseudo mathematical logic to it or something like that. And that did actually never work. There's no like science of the dialectic I don't think it actually happened that way. And so I think that in some ways the balance ought to come back to the novel, but we'll see if anybody wants to do that.
Beautiful.
Yes, that's really nice. I guess I would answer it because it is a very big abstract question in a way, like by saying that I don't know what it would mean for something not to be experienced exactly. And that, you know, the idea that there's something we're doing that's not an experience kind of is a question. It's like a question mark in itself, right? It's like you have an experience with language when you're reading it or writing it. You're having, I mean, the reason you're identifying with it is not because it's something other than experience, right? Like it just because it is experience, but also yeah, no, I had a thought that totally like it, like I saw it go past my own brain, but no, I think that it's all like experience, and that in fact the experience part, or the paying attention, the careful attention to one's unique experience, is exactly what's going to circumvent the sort of like tendency toward identification with simple boxes, you know. And that the more someone, you know, like Ellison does it, right? You know, yes, he draws these big lines, like here's the 20th century in a box, right? But then, you know, with every line, it's like you just have to follow the sentence, right? And that's an experience. You know, does it matter if it came from his life or if it came from somewhere else? I don't think so. I don't really care where it came from. But I also know that when people start to actually describe their experience when they're telling a story from their life, that's when I can no longer just reduce them to my first impression or something like that, right? So I think experience is sort of the well where it all comes from, right? Walter Benjamin is like, he says, if somebody in that storyteller essay, right, if someone goes somewhere, they have something to tell, right? If they have an experience, they have something to tell. And he talks about sort of like the way that their handprints left on the pottery of the potter, right? And that is sort of an occasion for story, right? And for connection and for continuity. And I think that it's all experience is the way I would say it. And I would have never said this earlier, right? Like that, but that's really like, you know, I've just come back to this sense, like that's all there really is like our experience of the world. And then we do all kinds of things with it. But like, that's how I feel about it, I think.
I'm gonna try and concretize in the form of a story briefly. I planted Invisible Man here. I think it's chapter 9 of Invisible Man. Invisible is walking, and he encounters a man who says, "You got the dog?"
Yeah.
And Invisible is totally puzzled, and Ellison's staging of this is brilliant. The man is pushing a cart in front of him, singing a blues song, and the cart is full of blueprints. So it might seem sort of cheesy and allegorical, but I had a student in my office yesterday, and I spent, I think, an hour and a half with a kind of intensity that alarmed office mates down the hall after the meeting was over, because it was so intense. But in the midst of trying to explain the thought that you could be walking the dog, or the dog could be walking you, and that you could be running, or you could be making progress, or you could be coasting, and talking about this notion of a plan, in the midst of this, I just said, stop. And we walked the circle of the English department. I said, let me walk in front of you. Now you walk beside me. Now you walk in front of me. And as we sort of did this, it sort of dawned on this student quite quickly that, to use a word you've been using a bit, Jackie, that Ellison's novel is an affordance. It's not like you're digging in there for the right allegory or the right answer, or no, this is in that you got the dog idiom is contained a kind of whole, I don't know, practical wisdom, or phronesis seems wrong, but it's something like that. And then there's the great line that he gives Invisible before he leaves, you know, all you need is grit, shit, and mother wit, which is also a nice little thing. And it kind of this small reading of 3 pages of the novel really made sense of what I've been trying to show my students the whole time, that Ellison is struggling against something that appears to be baked in to stories, which is a linear beginning, middle, and an end, and the way in which that notion of progress can really trick you. And he prefers his boomerang figure to this. So that's me paying my tax on introducing the word experience. If either of you want to respond to that, you're welcome to, but also now is the time people are free to sort of join the question if there's anything pressing. If not, I can keep going, but I wanted to let people.
I just wanted to say about the Ellison thing. I mean, but that's the whole thing that keeps that book together, right? Like, so when he introduces the sweet potato, the yam, right, or whatever, I mean, you can't understand that what he's doing with that yam unless you've put your teeth into something that transported you somewhere else, right? You just can't. Like, but if you do know that feeling, you pretty much understand what it means to fall through the cracks, right? Like, you don't have to read anything else. You're like, there it is. And so it seems that's the moment of identification that you can then follow him down the sort of Alice in Wonderland trap with, right? Because then you're open to what it is he's doing, but you got to get in there somehow. And so he gives us these moments where we get to go, oh, right? And then you can go slipping down. Right. And so it's really, for me, about the experience bit is like, you know, Baldwin talks about it always listening, right? Like the hearing, and Ellison does a bit too, right? This, you know, to actually hear, not just what somebody's saying, but like, for example, and like I was teaching Sonny's Blues the other day, right? And it's like throughout the whole thing, he's like, there's sounds from the street, and then there's music coming out, right? And then he says, most people don't know what it means to listen to music. So they hear it, but they don't listen, right? And that kind of thing. And in order to be able to listen, you actually have to have ears, right? Physically. Like, you have to walk around the loop in order to know what it means to walk. You have to listen, you have to have those ears. So there's something very physical about that question. And I think it's really important for us to sort of get our bodies back in the game and be like, yeah, walking, right? Walking, listening, tasting. And those are a moment of identification, but they don't tell us, like, that's precisely Ellison's sort of point with the yam. Like, it's not that it's not an Instagram moment where you sort of go, oh, that's me. It's just, what does he call it? I can't remember what the word is, but it's like a passageway, right? Where you enter another realm. And if we can use moments of identification to like open up those alternate realms, I feel like we got something in the toolbox that's already there for us that we can actually use. Like, we could just bring yams to class and be like, here, what happens when you take a bite out of this, right? Or, you know, go outside and stand under the trees or something. I don't know.
I have a little response to that that's sort of from the side of mediation, but it reminded me of something that happened, which was that when James and I were reading Whitman, like millions of years ago, we got to the section on calamus, and I went and found some calamus root, and I was like, oh, we should chew this stuff up. And I have to say, it made me a little bit sick, and I think you didn't take any, which is wise. Nasty stuff. But you know, I actually want to say something more from the side of mediation. And this is maybe more connected to that affordances sort of question, because to me, it's like, I tend to take the point of view that, like, I don't think that I can hear birdsong until I hear human music. You know, and that I think that it really went the other way for me. Likewise, you know, this notion of being, you know, transported by a bite. I mean, I guess, you know, my dog is sort of very like absorbed in a bite, you know, and I can see that, but I have to say, I'm not very embodied in that way. And maybe this is just a deficiency on my part, in that kind of unmediated, embodied, blah, blah, blah kind of experience that everybody seems very keen to get back to. But in my opinion, I mean, the experience of, you know, being transported by a bite, probably, you know, it first occurs to you when you've heard of Proust. and then it gets even better when you actually bother to read them. And you know, that in that way, like, I don't know that I want to say that these things are familiar only if you've had certain kind of, you know, physical or unmediated experiences, but rather that they supply the content to those experiences, and they supply sort of loci of thought sort of connected to those experiences. And so in this regard, I wanted to say about this is a crackpot tangent, but there's this wonderful guy Gibson, and he does sort of like phenomenology, but less annoying, or maybe more annoying, depending on, you know, where you're from. But you know, he has this lovely notion of the reporting affordance, and he sort of suggests that basically the consciousness is sort of something like the, you know, that things are marked by having a sort of describability to them, a planning to tell, a planning to report, a sort of, you know, that we're sort of implicitly organizing the information already. And that in that sense, you might say that like, maybe at the extreme, if you were like a real wild child, you might actually not have a lot of experiences, and that you would be sort of dead. And if you take that point of view, then you could say that, you know, it gives a lot to life, to have the ability to sort of, I don't know, find more ideas in concepts. And for me, I think more ideas and experiences. Because to me, if experiences don't have ideas in them, then I'm kind of not there.
Yeah, no, I think that,
People love their bodies much more.
yeah, I think that, well, I can speak for myself, and I think I speak from Christina too, where, you know, we're with Hegel that far, at least. Yeah. The unmediated business is no good. I suppose that it's rather about the sort of the mode of mediation or the form of access. I mean, that would be, for me, I follow you totally, Jackie. I had to read a lot about how neat and wonderful nature was before I actually could see it, or access it in those ways. That is, I totally buy the need to tutor the senses with ideas. This seems right. Now, I know Raquel had a question, so I'll shut up now, but don't ever accuse me of that, Jackie.
I messaged this to James saying it's a half-formed and probably terrible question, but regardless, there were a lot of words that were thrown out there that are like, you know, not trigger in like the social justice warrior kind of way, but like in the good way of like, these are words that I like, and when I put them together in this particular series, it makes my brain go ding. Affordances is a word that I don't just use, I teach about a lot because I teach design. And it's one of the realms where talking about, number one, trying to do more experimental reading with students in the design classroom has been really interesting, and starting to think about reading more novels in the design classroom is something that I'm trying to reconstitute my syllabus a little bit. And one of the things that I have been trying to get to my students a lot is how design is in and of itself another form of storytelling. And storytelling gets used in the design world in very particular ways, in similar ways that designers like to use ethnography as like a stand-in for just doing kind of shitty observation work, quite honestly, and not actually like doing ethnography like a lot of other people might recognize ethnography as being. Like storytelling becomes basically a marketing tool in design. And I'm kind of wondering here, I think, like, what might be ways that get students to grapple, or gets anybody to grapple with how storytelling is present, not only in written work, but actually present in everything that we're constantly interacting with. Like the example that I try to give them a lot is like talking about maximalism and minimalism in the home, and like who has a home that they might call maximalist and who has a home that they might term minimalist, and what stories are those things telling about their families as well. So I guess I just wanted to throw that out there of like storytelling beyond words. Yeah, half-formed and terrible. I tried to give a caveat there, sorry.
No, that's awesome. Jackie or Christina, do you have thoughts about that?
I mean, I don't know very much about it. I'm kind of like I'm very interested to hear more about it. Um, but I guess I think about that from the perspective of like maybe like disability architecture or something like that, where you could say that there's quite a lot of communication about sort of who's welcome or what's sort of a bit too much work to accommodate. And I think that those things are rendered quite invisible, and they seem to be interesting. I mean, they're I guess I kind of wonder what's going to happen with that because I always hear these stories about people busting up sidewalks with sledgehammers in Berkeley in the '70s. It seems like quite uh, fiery sort of moment. I wonder whether we're going to come back to that, and whether maybe part of the interesting thing is that there's been a sort of like a receding to me of those questions. Like I feel like I know a lot of people who talk about accessibility in more abstract terms, but they don't. It's not like a site of struggle for them in the same way. It's more of a site of complaint. And I wonder what would bring a change to that. Whether it's more kind of rock'em sock'em sort of street activism, whether it's like a revisiting the terms of the ADA or some new laws or something like that, or whether it's something that is more, I don't know, on the side of design. I think the nice thing about doing things on the side of design is that you don't have to get any politicians to agree with you. You can actually just make it. Like, that's fucking great. I feel like that seems like a nice thing. If everything's going to be privatized anyway, I mean, there's a lot of things that you can do on that side. But I don't know.
Christina, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I just want to say I used to teach many years ago. I was working at the Copenhagen Business School, and I was teaching storytelling to like CEOs. And when you were talking about like storytelling as marketing tool in the design world, right, that was very much, it was like another word for branding essentially. And as soon as we got to like anything that was complicated, they were like, yeah, but that's not what we want. Right. So it was just like this weird, it was like, so you don't really want storytelling, you want branding, you want the but in that context, I do think that like that kind of experiential or experimental learning or storytelling beyond words is kind of a radical thing, right? Because if you can actually get people to respond with their experience of an invention or a design, and not just go, oh, I want it because I've seen it on a billboard and I'm identifying with the capitalist or corporate story that tells me that I need that or that I want it and that I'm a loser if I don't have it. But if we can teach students or each other really to actually articulate our experience physically with the world, like what's it like to sit in this chair if you're if you're whatever, if it's designed for a disabled person but it doesn't feel right, like what does it mean to talk about that, right? And I think in the same way, like in the classroom, if we can actually get students to feel comfortable articulating their experience, not in these generic terms about like how they fit into the boxes that have been placed out there for them, then I think we can really change the conversation. And I feel like that's our responsibility as teachers in a way, is to point them there over and over again, right? So sometimes in the classroom, I'll take a chair or something, I'll put it up on the desk and I'll be like, okay, what do you see? And I need 25 observations because the first 15 are going to be the most generic. It's black, it's ugly, it's whatever, right? Like the thing that you already identify with because you know it from having seen it a million times. But if you go past 15 or past 20, they're like, there's nothing more to say. And I'm like, oh, there is more to say, right? And it doesn't matter what it is. So it's a waiting game also. Yes, you identify and then you see something you like or hate or whatever, but then you keep pushing and you say, right, what does it feel like to sit in this chair? Are you comfortable? Right? Like, and I think it's true what you guys both, Jackie and James, were saying about, of course, we all know more. We know or Shakespeare, like we know all about love because of Shakespeare, right? Isn't that the cliche? Like we wouldn't know how to love if we hadn't read Shakespeare or something like that, right? So yes, But at the same time, there is an equivalency in our own experience of the world, right? That isn't everything, but that's a portal. That's the word I was looking for before. A portal. That's what Ellison says, right? A portal to these other realms where things open up, right? And where the experience can be articulated as some sort of like interaction or between me and the world. And so I think there's a lot there.
Beautiful. I'm going to read this question from chat and then I'll get to you, Leroy, next. Devin Short says, I can't talk right now because I'm in the UW archive waiting through nuclear physics lab reports from the 1950s. But the reason I'm here is that I've been brought in to do an exhibit on the history of this lab. And the biggest challenge is definitely figuring out what story the thing is supposed to tell. No one wants to just look at a timeline. There has to be something holding the exhibit together. And the only thing that can do that is a story. But following Raquel, that might not be something in words. A physical exhibit is also a big design problem I haven't dealt with before. I mean, that's just a wonderful comment. I don't know that any of us have advice about how to curate that particular archive, but it seems maybe worth just getting on the record. Do you guys have responses to Devin, or should we move to Leroy's question?
So am I on now, James?
I guess you're on now, Leroy. Go ahead.
Oh, this is great. There's one particular matter that I want to go back to that I believe that both Christina and Jackie, touched on this. Jackie gave it the phrasing that I'm going to pick up on. It's the idea of moral errors. Yeah, and what damage can be done by those moral errors. And that almost always leads to the telling of a story. So I got one that I'm going to try to truncate and not have it go on forever. I'm part of a family where, aside from the weird Canadians who have names like Forsyth and other things unpronounceable, that ever went to college. So I came into this as having found out that I was more or less omnivorous. I would deal with anything, and ended up in the writer's workshop at the University of Iowa, and found that most of the things that I was seeing in those workshops was evidence of massive moral damage. People trying to overcome it, trying to deal with it. And then out of a series of circumstances that don't bear on this story much at all, I got serious about doing academic work, not from that experience of an undergraduate. But when I got a job at an alcoholics rehabilitation unit, where you find out very quickly, that the people who do the actual work in places like that are not the people with the PhDs or the MDs who design the experiments. It's the orderlies. And that's what my job was. How do you keep somebody who comes in alive? Make sure that in the first 20 hours they don't die. And you see a few of them do, and you realize that what you're going to have to do is pretty much ignore the academic discourse among the physicians. And you have to say, okay, how do we make contact? And in the commons room of this particular facility, most of the time was taken up with a degenerate rummy game. It's got a horrible name, but that's another story. But you just take some of the cards out of a rummy deck, and then it speeds up the rummy game like you would not believe. And you go very fast doing this, and then it'd be interspersed with short stories. Anecdotes. You get people to talk, and there's no likelihood at all that anybody's ever going to come out of there without the prediction that's fairly common in such places. They will leave here in 3 weeks, 5 weeks, and 2 weeks after that they'll be right back. The issue here of moral errors, it's connected to almost everything that both of you have been talking about. And I'd be interested in your reflections on this, because there are dangers in stories, but there are also, to use a word which I generally don't use, great affordances, in the stories. Because you can get a story where a short anecdote, my daughters early on realized that if they got me in the car, what I would do is anything would come up, I'd say, well, let me tell you a story. And they say, why don't you just write those down and give them numbers, then give us the book. And you say, number 61, and then they, ha ha, But the fact that without those stories, the damage multiplies and continues, and then the part of the question is, how do you get to the point where you can inhabit, the lives created or distorted or, inflected by all these moral errors, without putting yourself in the pious position of thinking that you're going to tell people, here are the things that are not moral errors. I'd just be interested in both of you, either of you, taking that on, because I think that's a really crucial thing. That there is a moral dimension to this, and it is not connected, with the things that we talk in a cliched way about values and stuff like that. So what choices are people making, and how do you get past it?
Well, I don't know that I have something very well. I have another story for you, because that's how this goes. I actually have two, but anyway, so one experience that really complicated a lot of these things for me was, like I said, I have a special needs daughter. She's nonverbal, so she's also she's nonverbal. She's got autism. She's got no attention span. She's like crazy to be around, and it's hard to be around her. She's also really funny, whatever. She's great. Anyway, so when I moved to this little town that I live in, I quickly surrounded myself by people of my own ilk, right? Like who are also from New York City and had other degrees and good lives and whatever. And it's really hard to fit someone like my daughter into that company, because those lives are really precious, right? So you go to dinner parties and she likes to like throw food on the ground and whatever. And it became very a source of great tension to have her with me, because I was sort of interrupting this idea of the good life that we were living, right, with her. And then I would take her to the playground in this little town that I live in, and it would be filled with families, not of my ilk, whatever that means, right? Like people that were local families that looked very different than me and wore different clothes, and many of whom had, less teeth than me or whatever. It's like that kind of, I live in a very small upstate town, and there was like this great sense of division between the newcomers and I would bring her to the playground, and to sort of make the long story short, they would embrace her in a way that was like, they would just like, when she would sort of go over and pull someone's hair or steal their toy or whatever, they would just tell their kids to kind of, play with her and help her out. And they would give her a toy, and they would invite us over for dinner and all this stuff. And it was like incredibly complicated for me to really understand how to feel about this, because these were people that if I had not had her with me, I would have dismissed in probably 30 seconds as like not, in my world. And meanwhile, my own sort of friends were having a really hard time accepting us into their lives because it was complicated. And I have seen so many instances, right, of the ways in which, if you don't tell these stories of these specific things that happen to you that are not in line with your expectations or the stories that are being told, I feel like you have a kind of a moral responsibility to tell those stories, right? Like I feel that the world she lives in, and what you said very much resonated with me, because it's the same in the institution or the home she lives in, right? Like the sort of administration they're going to want to, in very simple terms, say, is she aggressive or not aggressive? Is she this or is she that? Right. But if I ask the staff, they give me a long story about like who she actually is and how she actually interacts. And so whenever they, I just think it's so important to allow these stories, to tell these stories, right? But also to share them and to not just feel that it's something you're doing to correct something in your own life, but that without those stories, the world we live in becomes just reduced to those check boxes in the administrator's office. And so, I mean, I don't know that answers your question, but that's very much been my experience.
Beautifully put. Jackie, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I think that to the question of moral error, I guess I think that we can sometimes, we always live in dangerous times because there's always an insistence on the one hand that all of the old stories are obsolete, and that on the other hand, that's sometimes met with a kind of an alienatingly conservative response that the only stories are the old stories, and that seems to miss the mark as well. And so I think that part of the, dealing with the stakes of moral error is we might think like, well, what does it look like? If you're not going to be a Christian anymore, then you can't really quite describe people as being destroyed by sin in the same way. Don Giovanni being dragged down to hell by the stone guest or something like that just doesn't have a lot of oomph for us. And we typically don't believe that people will be sort of, physically afflicted in some way that sort of shows their, shows the rot in them. There are modern examples of stories like that, but I think of that as like a very medieval kind of way of seeing the world. And so this is something that interests me, like looking at someone like Coetzee, where you can see someone who you could describe it as a novel of an unpunished crime, or you could just say, well, this is a person who is completely cut off, and in a way that, by his actions, which he's responsible for, by these events. And you could say like, well, we have other models of that, like Tannhäuser or Cain, or but they seem to behave rather differently. And I think that maybe part of the stakes here is that the sort of the shape of moral consequences becomes sort of virtually unrecognizable. And I think that there is a need to somehow be able to connect to the idea that this is real life. And so this was something that, I don't know, I don't want to, I could describe how it works in my book, but in my book, part of the way that this works is that I have somebody that is convinced that he's very modern and that he has sort of hold of a new truth about himself and about the world. And it's mostly to do with a very different way of thinking about sex, a very different way of thinking about jealousy and about all this stuff. Because, this is the domain where, where so many people are, negotiating who they are. I seem to have fallen into the trap myself, pretty good cheese. But the thing is that, I don't want to simply say, oh, well, the joke's on him, right? Because I think that he perhaps correctly, has grasped some kind of nuance where, there's something about his story that seems very difficult to tell, and I think that makes him somewhat unrecognizable to himself, and finally, when he does begin to behave quite awfully towards other people, actually, sort of the last third of the book, he does some serious damage to other people's lives and his own, which are very clearly not going to be repaired. That there really are some stakes. And I think that maybe it's sort of, those stakes will look very differently for different people. I mean, I've known a lot of people for whom, the stakes are like, oh, if I fuck up, then I'll never get to be, a doctor. And my parents said that I should be a doctor or something like that. And then there are other people whose stakes are more like those that you might meet on this kind of ward for alcoholics that you were describing. It's like, the stakes are pretty serious. And I think that maybe that's part of the story for me is basically writing secular sin in a way. I mean, I think that that's like that's one picture of it. I don't know if that's a partial.
Leroy, you've got to unmute.
I got it, one of the reasons for posing the questions I did, and the fact that that degenerate rummy game where you take some of the cards out of the deck, turned out to be a facilitator of a remarkable kind, because the drama of a quick moving card game or some other activity where you're reading it don't have to engage such subjects as the possibility of moral error and how much damage is done. It opens a space in which the first thing you have to do is you say, if I'm going to understand this person, I will have to put it in some context where they can tell their story. And it's so easy then to be worried about such a concept as a moral error, while you're just over and over again repeating one. That you think that somehow I'm in the position, to be able to understand you. But until you tell me your story, there are all sorts of things where you then say, somebody picks up a story from a very particular traumatic episode, and the story is circulating in the culture they grew up in. It's associated with a whole set of normative decisions they have made. And they say, this is what I am, I will be this. And they tell that story, not recognizing that all the while they're telling that story, they're wrecking their family. They're making everybody around them horribly miserable. Then you end up with something where the idea of how do you tell this story? How do you do it? I think that the example, Jackie, is someone who believes they're thoroughly modern and you've got the answer to all of this. That's all over the place, where people think they've got it figured out, and they haven't yet understood, that as soon as somebody starts to tell their story, then you can recognize, that they have followed a particular trajectory which is approved and sanctioned by their community. And it becomes something that leads to endless repetition of the same mistake, generation after generation. And then I think one of the interesting thing about this conversation, is that part of the danger of this, is that you do have to preserve some sense, of what possibilities are there. It doesn't have to just be about real stuff, but to contrast that with imagination. Imagination is an actual mental power, is not something that's set apart from reality. It's the very means by which you can explore it, and it allows you to reflect and do other things. And then we end up with mistakes on either side, thinking that if I just tell you this story about what really happened, then that'll fix everything. And then you discover pretty quickly that doesn't work. Or you say, if I give you the right version, then that'll work, and that'll fix it. That doesn't do it either, because most of the time the complexity of it is something that surprises you and ambushes you, and you end up then having to say, okay, how can I tell this? But I think we're in a time right now where there's more risk involved with people who think they've got the answer than we've ever encountered before.
I think that's, Leroy, that's just so right. I mean, two thoughts that maybe could get allow, or I'll just interrupt you because I can. I have the power to. One thought is that another aspect that we haven't done is that all of us certainly have had a story that we've told about ourselves that has cast us in some light, and it's been repeated in company until you encounter that one person who says, my God, what a fucking asshole you are. And all of a sudden, right? So that's some other aspect of this. That is that we'll keep using affordance, even though it's a word Leroy doesn't like. That one thing that a story affords is that possible twist in the tale. in trying to articulate and narrate something, and then in the company that you do it with, you can discover something can really legitimately be revealed. I think that's great. And then Christina, I'll just add that I think you're just so right to say that one other aspect of story is that it sits against many of the structures of assessment and valuation, in a bad sense, that kind of predominate in the social world. And so all of us, or if you're a teacher, or if you're a person who's trying to explain to a student why, to use Jackie's example, look, it's not really that important you get an A here, your life won't end. You're working at the level of anecdote, of narrative, of story that is so particular. And sometimes even when you try to tell a colleague about a great day in class, it will fall flat. Sometimes story doesn't have the power to render that. But those are two thoughts. Jackie, Christina, anybody else in the room have thoughts about this sort of moral dimension of what we're doing, or other thoughts?
I mean, I think it's a wonderful thing that we kind of have like a slightly formal discourse of stories that sits alongside of the moral one. And I think it's sort of just, maybe it's some friction generates a little bit of heat there, that this seems to sort of carry our thinking along a little bit. And this, to me, I think comes back to the question of, before I was talking about cliches, and I like, there would not seem to be a moral dimension of cliches, but if you sort of say, well, but I tell these stories about who I am, why I do the things that I do, and that in some ways it's actually, I have to sort of hear my own tin ear. I was trying to come up with a really bad sentence. But I think I have to hear my own tin ear in order to kind of let go of a story at times, and sort of recognize the real stakes of it. And, which is probably not a process that ends. But I think about, maybe, youth can feel like that. I feel like somehow there's a very funny thing where I think, I'm in my mid or late 30s, so I've reached the age where people who complain about their parents a lot, I really have to wonder, did you not figure out that they were doing something a bit difficult that nobody had a guide for, but it's, that would be, kind of like a sort of a silly example. But then, there are some not so silly examples. Like, I mean, my experience reading The Magic Mountain has been really interesting. And I kind of hesitate to talk about a book that I haven't finished. But I think that, in this book, Castorp, he's going to visit his friend at this sanatorium, and he doesn't think of himself as a sick person. And somehow, midway through, he kind of gradually makes this decision to join the sick and to think of himself as one of them. And there's something a little bit more comfortable about that. And he's releasing something about life. And I think that kind of question is like, I know a lot of people that negotiate their lives almost entirely through a diagnosis, whether that is medical or sort of sexological, or sort of through disability or something like that. And, I don't want to deny that these things matter. But I think that maybe there's some deep content in that decision to join the sick. And I think that that's easier to recognize when it becomes one story of many. And maybe that's part of how a book like The Magic Mountain begins to work, is that, you can see, it's this tremendous sort of catalog of positions and experiences and so on, but it's also a catalog of all of these things somehow inactivated. Somehow they're all butterflies that have pinned themselves under the glass, and why have they done so? And I think that's kind of I don't know. So maybe this is maybe a case for engaging not as much with a single narrative, but with sort of the broader fact of literature, makes these things a little bit easier to think about.
I think that's totally right. I just want to second that. I think that part of actually, the more you engage with story, the more you become aware of the storied nature of the world, and therefore it becomes easier to not be locked into stories, right? Because the real danger of stories is when they're unconscious, or that we don't recognize them as stories, but as truths, right? Or as, inevitabilities or whatever. And I think that the awareness that sort of runs through much literature of the storied nature of the world, and also, I mean, of the way in which both the importance and danger of stories go hand in hand, right? That we need to tell stories, and we also need to recognize the sort of like advertisement level way of telling stories that's to sell you stuff, right? And that it's actually possible to do both. And I think that's the most important thing for me, is like, it's not really whether stories are inherently bad or good, or moral or amoral. It's that some of them have cause moral error, some of them cause moral damage, and some of them don't. And you'll have to somehow just navigate this, and this is as good as it gets. And just that kind of, I think, adaptability and flexibility around what it is we do with stories, I think, is like what we can ideally talk about in a classroom, in a community, whatever, right? Where stories circulate and are shaped and reshaped so that they don't become generational stories, right? Of repeated error. Like, I mean, I teach in prison, and like, that is the outcome. The prison system in America is the outcome of just repetition of the same story over and over and over again, right? I mean, the guys will say that, right? Like it's like in their families and in their behavior, and like, and the way that they're perceived, and and we have these fantastic conversations about, like, when I come in there, what are my assumptions about them? What are the stories that I bring, and what are the stories they have about me? And so we put them on the table, right? And we try to be honest about it, and it's very uncomfortable at times, right? But then just in that exchange, you can start to go, okay, how do we adjust these stories, right? Like, how do we not just become victims of somebody's story about me, or my story about you? And I don't know that there's like a model for how to do this, right? It just takes time and patience, yeah.
Wonderful. You've both provoked people. I'm loving the symmetry we have. I want to say something about gossip in the novel now, but Raquel, then Leroy, you both raised hands, so I'll let you guys go.
It just kind of strikes me what Christina is saying also about this process of storytelling also is like a sharing of prejudgments and preconceived ideas and assumptions, is that storytelling, and then thinking back to my question about design, is that storytelling is intervention. And there's something really interesting about thinking about storytelling as intervention, as like interrupting somebody else's narrative and interrupting somebody else's way of thinking. I share this video that was part of my master's research with students a lot as a way of getting them to think about design and accessibility, linking to Jackie's comments around disability architecture, which is a video that's rather simple. It's just wheelchair users getting on a bus. And I give them no explanation of the context of how this was filmed. And I try to get them to tell, like, to tell me what they see and tell the story of what they see. And each time they tell the story, each time they tell me their observations, I add another layer, right? And I'll say, like, okay, well, here's the context of where this was filmed. This was for a research on accessibility. And then all of a sudden they start seeing new things. And then I'll finally kind of tell them the story that I got from wheelchair users as a person that was involved in that research, where they're telling me, oh, these videos are harrowing. These wheelchair users are really struggling to get on the bus with the ramp, and it's really difficult to see, and et cetera, et cetera. And then in my interviews and the stories that the wheelchair users are telling me, they're like, oh my God, this was like the dream scenario for getting on a bus, right? This was fantastic. Like, the bus was stationary for a really long time. I could try multiple times. There was nobody else on a bus. There was nobody in the wheelchair priority area. Like, I could take my time. And it's really interesting to like see them just kind of like taking those layers out and like or adding them, I guess, and like seeing that type of intervention, that new layers to a story add on to how they think about the world and what they're starting to realize. So yeah, I think just more of a realization of how storytelling functions in that very particular way is really fascinating too.
Beautiful. Leroy, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, one of the texts that I found most rewarding, but also immensely trying, was Coetzee's Foe. Not Disgrace. I mean, Disgrace is another kind of thing, but in Foe you have Coetzee conducting what amounts to a book-length seminar, on what are the conditions under which a story can be told at all. And he then goes back to Robinson Crusoe, as one of those that becomes just paradigmatic, that doesn't begin to catch all of the nuances of that term. But the story has to be like that. You have this heroic figure who does these things, and now he has the main narrator, is a woman who has an entirely different story to tell. And we get something that's not like the story of Crusoe, and it turns out that the focus throughout, as this proceeds, is the presence of Friday, who has no tongue and therefore cannot articulate his voice, and the female narrator in this case realizes that unless the person who is there with Crusoe does not validate or confirm the story she's trying to tell, it can't be told. And I think the way he handles that, is so that it emphasizes the extraordinary precondition of being able to tell a story is that you have to be in touch with your own voice, and so other people have to be able, to hear it. And he gives us at the end of Foe, what he provides is this extraordinary image, of the place that Friday has gone to cast leaves on the water, descending into a sunken ship. And then he opens his mouth, and what comes out is like a flood of water that goes from end to end of the earth, everywhere. And it's a perhaps too nifty solution to the narrative problem that Coetzee has created. But it's to say, how do you get to the point where somebody can find their voice, or somebody else provides a voice that they can recognize, and treat as a surrogate that actually works, and going back to that experience of working in an alcoholics rehabilitation unit for a couple of years, that degenerate, card game, is the very thing that made it possible for people to say, there are some stories here that I told you, if I ever did tell you, and I heard that you had gone to a bar in Davenport, I would have to come after you and kill you. And you realize they mean it. The story is not one that they want to have told. And aside from that extremity, there are lots of cases where people can't tell the story, because to do so would mean a disassembly of a whole sense of who they were, where they were, how they got to be what they are. And so in that respect, that idea, of how you can use imagination as a way of engaging this, can have real consequences, and they don't turn out to be good blackboard examples, but in terms of what happens when somebody gets to the point where they find a voice and they can tell it, that's big.
Well, one thing I would just want to add here that maybe is a way to sort of try and bring some continuity to what we've been saying. The getting on the bus, the card table conversation, the conversations we all have while drinking coffee or smoking cigarettes or in moments of crisis. the thing that's remarkable, that one thing you're always trying to show students is, though they feel like they're yours, that they're not. You know, as Christina says, the world is storied. And Jackie, you rightly pointed out, there's this problem of cliche, right? And one of the difficulties is, you know, first you have to learn the pain of the cliche, and then you have to go find out, or you don't have to, but it might be helpful to you to go find out. And of course, literature is this more formal realm of imagination and of textual production, and bears on the more, I don't want to call it ordinary, because that's not quite right, but you know what I mean, the more mundane or everyday sense. And you know, when I asked the question about experience, and Christina said, well, it's sort of all experience. I mean, that's exactly one of the things that I'm trying to sort of emphasize by pulling these together. That is, you know, to embarrass you, Jackie, I mean, when I read Daryl, it was such a, I couldn't exactly tell you, I can't tell you in this recording why it was such a right time for me to read that story. But there are a lot of Daryls. I think we do know a lot of Daryls. And what I found so absolutely deadly moving was that you weren't cruel to him. That at the end, one feels so badly for him. You know, I feel bad for him in the way I feel bad for the 20-year-old kid who is convinced that their parents really are the worst thing that ever happened to them. You know, not without reason, but so I don't know, all of that is to put something out there. We're running close to the end of the session, but I wanted to give space to Christina and Jackie if there's anything else you guys wanted to say before we ended. I feel like I could keep talking forever, especially now that we have all these texts up in the air, but we're running out of time, as I said. So
I just want to quickly say that the way that, you know, the complexity of like the way that stories sort of contain us and whatever, it's so humbling when you see that working on your end too, right? The other day I was in class and we were reading Dennis Johnson's Emergency, right? And his stories are all about just like acceptance of these, like you were saying that about Jackie's Daryl, right? And like he just sort of lets them have these moments of sort of humanity, however fucked up they are, right? And I was struggling to get the students to really understand what it was he was doing with these characters and whatever. And I had already sort of like flatlined on all of them. I was like, it's just, they don't get it, whatever. And then this one student just raises her hand, right? And does this like beautiful moment. She like goes, oh, but it's just like this wrinkle in time. And she talks about how this is just life. And she gives all these examples and she starts telling stories from her life and all this kind of stuff. And I was just, you know, baffled. And because she just transformed in front of me from like this sort of dead student in the corner who didn't have the capacity to understand what it was I was trying to say, because it was so insightful, whatever it was I was trying to say, to this brilliant reader, right? And I just cherish those moments so much. And I just wanted to say that because I think it's also our own, the way we story the world, right? And certainly in the academic world, right? About like what our role is in the world, the importance of the humanities and all the great things that we do, and the way we tell everybody else that, you know what I mean? Like we have our stories of the world, and I really cherish, I have learned to, I haven't always, but in my great age, I've learned to cherish these moments where I see my story become untrue in front of somebody else, become untrue in front of me. And I just think that's so powerful. And that's really at the heart of it for me, are these moments where these shifts happen, right? There's just this sort of like, oh, I got this situation. I know who you are. I don't know who you are. I'm in control of this Zoom space. I've got you all pegged. And then somebody says something and you're like, whoa, right? Because they're telling a story of something that they experienced. And I just think that's the only way to shift any of these dynamics. And I think the more, we can just learn to do that in the classroom and not feel threatened by it, or in our communities, I think we can really shift stuff, for ourselves and for those around us. Those would be my, that's my redemptive closing moment.
Wonderful. Jackie, you got any thoughts before we get out of cyberspace?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was thinking back to the example again of the alcoholic rehabilitation, and I was thinking about the idea that maybe like I don't love the word addiction, but it describes something, right? And I think that whatever it's describing has a huge amount of narrative and even sometimes propositional content, which is not really mined out because everything is so admired in shame, so admired in stigma. There's so much damage to lives that we don't necessarily have time. It seems to hear people out, and also some of the stories that people have include, large mixture of justifications for why they shouldn't be heard, and that falling into silence is sort of a part of it. And you could say that that is a domain of cliche, that is a domain of bad storytelling, and it certainly isn't something that you want to come after with a red pen exactly. Although maybe, I mean, I have to say, I'm not entirely sure that the totally hands-off approach is the right thing everywhere. It might be the right thing in the classroom. But the thing about it is that I guess just sort of pulling that out, I mean, just to name some kind of narrative elements, I think that, for some reason today I wanted to talk about stories of damnation. I mean, there's a lot of other kinds of stories, but one of the ways that that goes, how to put it? It's like there's a sense that self-destruction is a kind of a communication, and I think that it can be sort of very interesting. If you can, if you can stand to listen long enough, you will hear it. That actually a person who may seem to have gone almost entirely silent is in fact telling a story to someone, and probably not only to themselves. And so, anyway, that's something I've maybe find helpful.
Oh man. That's so unfair, Jackie. We can't, I mean, I cannot end there. I mean, I guess we sort of have to. I know that
I got time.
okay, well, yeah, cool. I know that Christina will tell you, or wanted to tell you, as that that of course no one would ever advocate the hands-off approach. But yeah, but also to your point that well, yeah, now I'm silent, or
Well, you're just gonna come stand in the hallway while James does his hands-on.
that would be so, God, that would be great.
It's
Well,
really a joy being next to him when that happens.
yeah.
Let me just one little tiny story. The relief during those 2 years was this very large Chevrolet Suburban van that the unit owned. And on Saturday afternoon, we would sort of vie for who gets a chance to take the people who were nearing the end of their stay in the unit out for a tour of the Iowa countryside. And it was great. Because what almost always happened is there was one person in particular we wanted in the car. His name was Charlie. And he was absolutely the best short storyteller you ever heard. And it was just in the great cure there was laughter, because he had managed to take an absolutely ruinous life, and had so honed these anecdotes to the point where you end up in such laughter, you'd have to stop the car. It's not possible to drive anymore. And it's very often seemed to me, well, it's not exactly curative. It was the one point of relief in that otherwise very, very discouraging enterprise, where you say, okay, if you tell these stories, and people get the story and they recognize that's really funny, because when you knew the person, you knew the circumstances, and you put it in a context of real stuff, it's not funny at all. But the story ends up doing something that allows people to say, well, we can go on.
beautifully, perfectly put. And I'm going to close it with a note from Richard in chat, which is just perfect. Richard says, there's a Russian joke about the numbered stories that Leroy mentioned. Two good friends, Vanya and Misha, did just that, numbering their various anecdotes and jokes, and then just telling each other these numbers. One day, Vanya grins and tells Misha, number 57, but Misha doesn't laugh. Vanya is kind of upset and interrogates why Misha didn't laugh, to which Misha replies, I didn't like the way you told it. A perfect, perfect way to end. Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you, Jackie and Christina. This was a great and totally unexpected conversation. So thank you all. Really appreciate it. I'm gonna end the session now.
Thank you so much. Great to be
Thank
here.
you so much for having me. It's wonderful
Yeah.
to see you again.
Right.
Take care.